join me in welcoming Shir Ganor.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming this evening and bracing this weather. We're supposed to get used to it, but then they take it away from us for 2 months, and then all of a sudden it's all new. So I really do appreciate you being here tonight. I also want to thank the folks at Mount Zion, Rabbi Spielker, Gabby, and Maria for their support and help in setting this up, and at the Center for Jewish Studies, to Natan and Marielle for organizing this evening. As Natan mentioned, I study and write about refugees who fled National Socialist persecution. And these are all people who lived an extraordinary life in a remarkably disruptive time period. Today, I will talk about a person whose life was maybe extra extraordinary, even within this historical cohort. This person, Annemarie Hase, shared with hundreds of thousands of members of this community of faith the violence of anti-Semitic persecution, of political oppression, and of displacement. But her path in displacement was quite remarkable, and that will be the topic of my talk this evening, namely her involvement in the British psychological warfare against Germany during the Second World War, which took place within the framework of the BBC German service. In this capacity, she, the Jewish socialist cabaret performer, who was banned from German stages, banished by German society, and forced to flee her home, in her capacity as a British propagandist, Annemarie Hase found a most intimate connection to the German public. She spoke to them directly through the radio in secret. They were not allowed to listen to her, or to any BBC broadcast for that matter. And she won their affection, even their love, but they had no idea who they were listening to. So let me start by introducing our main protagonist. Annemarie Hase was born in Berlin in the year 1900 under the name Anita Hirsch. She was the third of 5 children. Her father was a chemist who owned a soap manufacturing factory. And the family lived a convenient middle-class life in Berlin, at least until 1913, with her father's death by suicide. His death was surely a devastating event in personal terms, but also in terms of financial hardship, the family suffered through that quite harshly. Her mother even had to make the very difficult decision to hand in her 2 younger children to orphanages in the city. So Annemarie Hase, she was the third, so she was able to remain at home and complete her schooling. I apologize, but occasionally I will have to walk to the computer to change slides, so here I go. Already at quite a young age, Annemarie Hase developed a dream to become a performer, an actor. And she was admitted when she was 18 to the Max Reinhardt School of Theater. It was then in Germany considered a very prestigious training ground for theater performers. And at this school, the instructors that she came in contact with very quickly spotted her potential as a comedian. After her training, she was hired for a few small roles, but she was very quickly drawn to cabaret performances and to the bustling cabaret scene in Berlin. This was the early 1920s, in the aftermath of the First World War, in what was known as the Weimar Republic, Germany's first democracy, that was known for the artistic atmosphere that brewed in it. And cabaret as an art form was experiencing a particular boom in that time period. Hase, with her knack for comedy and also with her talents, with her musical talents, she could sing quite well. She was really primed for that environment. So as I mentioned, she was hired to perform sort of classical theater roles occasionally in Shakespeare, and she performed in original pieces by Bertolt Brecht, but her main success was in cabaret and in variety shows, where she made somewhat of a name for herself as a chansonnière, as a cabaret performer, and as a comedy artist. Like a good number of people in Berlin's performance and theater scene, Hase was Jewish. But her relationship to Jewishness, from our perspective today, might seem a little unclear and perhaps even strange. Hase grew up in an assimilated Jewish family and was even baptized at birth. But we shouldn't take this to mean a rejection or a denial of Jewish belonging. Baptism of German Jews at this time period, it was not entirely uncommon. It had nothing to do with religion. It was more a matter of pragmatism and maybe even strategy. Hase's family had no connection to any church. They did not convert to Christianity. But her parents came of age at an era in Germany in which baptism could help open doors for people. And many, though certainly not the majority, of secular Jews and acculturated families took that step, even if they did not distance themselves from Jewishness afterwards. So again, we shouldn't read this as a rejection of Jewishness. Certainly, it was not an embrace of a Jewish identity, right? Unfortunately, Annemarie Hase, she didn't leave an autobiography or a memoir or anything like that where she fully addressed her relationship to Jewish identity. So all we have left to work with are her behaviors, her choices, her experiences to try to find kind of traces to decipher what her relationship to her Jewish identity may have been. And from these traces, what I gather is that she certainly maintained some connection to Jewish belonging and to Jewish people throughout her life, but it seems that this was just not the defining element of her identity. It's important also to note that in Germany at that time, baptism or no baptism did not necessarily mean anything for how one was coded socially. For the vast majority of German society, she would be seen as a Jew anyway. But it wasn't only that she wasn't fooling anyone. My point is that she wasn't trying to fool anyone. And I think that distinction is important. She certainly did not belong to the circles of hyper-assimilated Jews who tried to pass as non-Jews. Jews who tried to live that life, generally they tried the best they could to distance themselves from any traces of Jewishness, any type of connection to Jewish people, to Jewish themes. And that is not the case with Hase. So, for example, one musical number that she performed and recorded and became known for was titled, "The Jews Are to Blame for Everything." And this is a satirical song. It came out in 1931. I'll play you just the first part. It's in German. The text in German will be up at the top, and then you'll see an English translation just below it. This is not my translation, and I don't think it's 100% perfect, but it will give you a good sense of what she's singing there. Right, so just to reiterate that, this clearly is in the context of Germany at that time, for a Jewish person to openly be singing this song is very much not a rejection or a denial of Jewish belonging. It is something of a signal that she does maintain a connection to her Jewish identity. It was perhaps not the most important part of her identity, certainly not before 1933, but she was not in denial about it and was not trying to hide it from anyone. Of course, 1933 changed everything. With Hitler in power and the Nazi regime beginning to implement its anti-Jewish agenda, Annemarie Hase's life radically changed. The anti-Semitic policies that were being enforced by the regime affected her almost immediately following the establishment of the Nazi dictatorship. One of the very first decrees that came out when the Nazi regime established itself forbade Jewish performers from appearing in the public spheres. So performers like Annemarie Hase, not only were they attacked by the regime's propaganda that their Jewish vile art is corrupting the spirit of the German people, she was also banned from performing on most stages in Germany. So specifically banned from performing to non-Jews. She was still allowed, like other Jews, to perform in front of Jewish-only audiences. Which she did. She continued to perform to audiences of Jews in Germany. But we have to also take into account that beyond just the degradation that was involved in that, in that policy, the economic implications of that were very tangible. So performers like her also suffered financially from these employment restrictions. Performing to Jewish audiences may have been a healthy outlet for her at the time, but with the dispossession and the degradation and the discrimination against Jews continuously intensifying, she decided to leave and to seek refuge outside of Germany. In November 1936, she immigrated to England. Her younger brother was able to escape to London a couple of years before that and had already settled down there, so she joined him there in London. As a refugee in London, she was safe from the threat of Nazi violence, but she was exposed to the difficulties of life and displacement, which included, again, financial hardship, the insecurity of living as a non-citizen, and everything that is attached to that. She took on a series of odd jobs, cooking, cleaning, whatever she could do to sustain herself in these precarious conditions. But she also did not stay away from the stage long, and she found opportunities to continue to perform alongside other refugees in theater productions of refugee clubs and anti-fascist cultural associations that were emerging in London at the time with the influx of more and more refugees from first Germany, then Austria, then continuously more and more annexed territories that came under Nazi control. The groups that she performed with staged shows both in German and in English, and many of their performances focused on a vocal and decisive message against Nazism, against tyranny, and against racism. In September 1939, famously, England declared war on Nazi Germany following the German invasion of Poland, which signaled the outbreak of the Second World War in Europe. Life changed dramatically for everyone in the country, and for refugees like Annemarie Hase, the war created an especially strained situation. Many of these refugees, first of all, they still had loved ones who were living under Nazi terror, and the war complicated their opportunities to escape. Many German refugees in England were also suspected by the British authorities as spies, and they were subjected to enemy alien restrictions, including internment, even though they themselves were victims of Nazism and of German persecution. And of course, as refugees, they were particularly vulnerable to the economic turbulences that always exist during wartime. For Annemarie Hase, the war also brought a unique opportunity. In the summer of 1940, she was contacted by the BBC and was asked to audition for a new show that would be playing on the BBC's German service program. The German service program of the BBC was a German language broadcast that launched in the summer of 1938 as part of Britain's attempt to resolve the intensifying tensions that were caused by Germany's aggressive annexations in Europe. And Britain, with its policy of appeasement, was hoping to resolve this by means of diplomacy. So the idea was to address German society in their own language and on their own terms, directly through the radio wavelength, so as to create a public consensus against further escalating tensions and against warmongering. That didn't work out, as we know, and when the war broke out, the function of the BBC German service then switched from diplomacy to psychological warfare. Working under the guidance and under the supervision of intelligence authorities, the German service crafted an expansive and very impressive program of propaganda broadcasts with the intention of speaking directly to the German public, sort of speaking over the Nazi regime and reaching everyday Germans, trying to persuade them that their country is fighting a futile war, that defeat is inevitable, and that their government is leading them towards destruction and misery. For this to work well, these broadcasts needed to be accessible to everyday Germans, and they needed to sound convincing. Obviously, they needed to be in German, but beyond just the language question, the content of the broadcasts needed to be based on a deep cultural familiarity with German society. And as we know from many other contexts, marketing campaigns don't work if you don't understand the audience that you're trying to reach. And who in England at the time could have done this job? Refugees from Nazi Germany, the vast majority of whom were Jews. As fate would have it, or as history rather would have it, England at the time had quite a large community of German-speaking refugees who could take on this role and become improbable psychological warriors. So these were people who were rejected by their home countries, rejected by their societies, deemed as foreign, dangerous elements in their homelands. They were accused of being not only un-German, but even as enemies of the German people. And then all of a sudden, under the circumstances of a global war and from the distance of displacement, it was precisely their deep connection with German society and their deep connection to the German people also that made them so well suited for the role of public sentiment crafters. And Annemarie Hase was among those who were invited to take part in this project. Specifically, Annemarie Hase was invited, she was tasked with voicing and performing the character of Frau Wernicke in a series that was created specifically to address German women and especially German working class and lower middle class women. Excuse me. Frau Wernicke was a kind of a subversive protagonist. She openly protested against what she saw as the exploitation of the German population by the Nazi party bosses and their cadre of profiteers. She pointed out in her broadcasts how the regime's policies were hurting the German people with food shortages, with financial ruin, and with endless loss of life. For example, one day Frau Wernicke was talking to one of her friends about an old rag that she found somewhere in her home after she discarded it previously. And then Wernicke was telling her friend, "Oh, we used to throw this kind of stuff away, and now it's the finest of the finest, huh? Yeah, you're right about that. What used to be a piece of trash previously, before the great years, is a great thing now in the trash years." Wernicke's biting remarks against the regime even got her into serious trouble. And as part of the series' plot, she was sent to a concentration camp. And she was released upon the condition that she help disseminate Nazi indoctrination in her neighborhood. But Wernicke stuck to her own, and she continued to voice her opposition, which resounded even more bitingly when she was sarcastically reciting Nazi propaganda, only to mock it in the process. So, for example, when she was fake chastising a group of neighbors for their lackluster enthusiasm for the war, she told them, "Peace is maybe good enough for the degenerate plutocrates or whatever those wimps are called. Our ideal, my dear folk people, is that nothing on this earth is as beautiful as war. Life is hardly worth living if you're not allowed to die for the Führer and for the Third Reich." And that's how Wernicke's satire operated. She parroted slogans of the regime, but she parroted them as caricatures. And in doing that, she exposed how harmful and how vile they actually were. A key advantage in her propaganda was that she spoke to audiences as one of their own. Her social status as a blue-collar worker and her kind of street smarts demeanor marked her as someone who addressed German listeners as an equal. She spoke in sharp Berlin dialect, which in Germany indicates not only a regional affiliation, but also a class affiliation. It is most commonly associated with the working classes. Like all other broadcasts of the BBC German service, Frau Wernicke was also reiterating constantly the distinction between the Nazi leadership and the Nazi ideologues who bore the direct responsibility for the regime's criminal acts, and between the people in German society who presumably were just forced to play along and carry the burden against their will. So through Frau Wernicke, through this character, British intelligence authorities were able to design a relatable and agreeable package for their messaging. A package that they believed that Germans could be receptive to. Frau Wernicke's character was quite a success, but that success was the success was to a great extent thanks to a very gifted scriptwriter, Bruno Adler. He was also a Jewish refugee from Bohemia, and it was also thanks to Annemarie Hase's acting skills and her comedic talent. In addition to her masterful command of the Berlin dialect, Hase had years of experience of performing political satire in front of German audiences. She knew what she was doing. So the role of a saucy and raunchy underdog observant was one that she was well familiar with from her career before 1933. I want to give you a taste of how she sounded like. So I'll play a short clip from one of the only recordings that we have left from this show. It's very hard to translate Frau Wernicke. As you could tell, when I was telling her jokes, it wasn't funny. I can tell you when she's telling them, it's way funnier. Maybe I'm not as funny as Bruno Adler was writing, but also it's because the Berlin dialect makes it really difficult to translate into, I would say even to other German dialects maybe. but also because the form of her monologues also always pivot her as having a conversation with someone who we're not hearing. So you have to really be in the moment to understand what she's saying. So I'm not going to offer a full translation. I'll just explain what's happening in the scene. So she is sitting and mending old rags with some neighbors, with a group of women, and one of them is suggesting that they start playing the BBC broadcasts in secret because it was forbidden to tune into the BBC broadcasts. The regime forbade it. Frau Wernicke, in her role as a faux defender of the regime, she protests against that, and she's telling her friends, one moment you're just turning on the radio, and then the next you're a full-on Volksschändling, a harmful element to the German folk. So I'll just play this very short clip. It will give you an idea of how Hase acted this character.
Der Doktor hat uns doch auseinandergepflückt, warum es denen nicht gut, wenn sie Auslandsstudenten werden, weil sie nämlich national vereinigt sind. Wir haben ein Volk, ein Führer, aber der Tribut stirbt nicht für die nationale Einheit. Da verlassen Leute den Himmel. Der weiß nicht besser. Ich sage, solange wir nicht ganz geeinigt sind, dürfen wir nicht hören, weil wir nicht geeinigt sind. Und wenn wir mal geeinigt sind, brauchen wir nicht hören, weil wir uns denn ja einig sind. Ist doch klar drüber.
Okay, so what she was telling them is, we need to trust our Dr. Goebbels. He knows what he's saying, and as we can't listen to these harmful broadcasts because we're not nationally united enough, not strong enough to be receiving these messages. And when we'll be united enough, then we won't need to listen to these things anyway. So that's the type of humor that Frau Wernicke had to offer. Let me go back to the slides. Okay. So it's difficult to measure the success of propaganda broadcasts, right? Especially during wartime. Only after 1945, only after the war was over, did the British authorities really discover the full extent of Frau Wernicke's popularity during the war. But even when the war was still ongoing, they were able to gather intelligence that testified to her success and to her resonance with German listeners. For example, when Hase asked for a raise for playing the role of Wernicke, one of the BBC editors supported her request, and he wrote a memorandum to their superiors, and he told them that, I'm quoting, "Frau Wernicke is one of the very best of the regular features of our German service, and evidence from inside Germany shows us that her propaganda value is enormous. Hence, Ms. Hase is for us extremely valuable person." Reportedly, Frau Wernicke was even Joseph Goebbels' favorite show on the German service. The propaganda minister, of course, he had to listen very carefully to what the BBC was putting in order to plot how he would counter it, and Frau Wernicke was reportedly his favorite. Frau Wernicke also caught the attention of the British press, and several articles appeared during the war that celebrated the show and celebrated the character. One paper reported in 1941, "In Germany, she's known as Frau Wernicke, the shrill-voiced, truculent, irrepressibly fearless Berlin housewife who speaks her mind. At the BBC, she's known as a gifted German ex-actress whose real name must remain a secret. To Dr. Goebbels, she's a major headache because Frau Wernicke's monologues are rapidly becoming the rage among German listeners." Why did the voice behind Wernicke had to be kept secret? It appears that the BBC feared that revealing Annemarie Hase's true identity, a Jewish refugee, would compromise Wernicke's appeal to German listeners who thought of her as one of their own, a fellow German. This policy was not unique to Hase. The refugees who took part in the German service's broadcasts and who were tremendously important to the success of the broadcasts, they all remained nameless and anonymous during the war years. And this reveals a fascinating and somewhat disturbing paradox that lay at the heart of the German service's work. These people were recruited precisely because they were Germans or Austrians or Czech or Central Europeans. They had not just the knowledge, but also the life experience and the cultural background that was necessary to speak to Germans from a place of affinity. But their genuine affinity was also seen as a potential threat to the BBC's intelligence operations, because this affinity was denied and rejected back home by their own people, by the audience that the BBC was trying to reach. In Hase's case, her background, her personal history as a native Berliner, her talent as an actor, the vast experience that she brought entertaining German audiences and making German audiences laugh, it gave her just the right pitch to play the Frau Wernicke character persuasively. But it was also this combination that required the concealment of her identity. It's difficult to assess the damage that disclosing her identity would have had on the show's reception and on its propaganda value. After all, there was a time when German audiences cheered on Annemarie Hase and accepted her. But these days were gone. And even if not all covert listeners who were listening, often hiding under their covers so that they would not be found, even if not all of them were ardent followers of the National Socialist ideology, that still didn't mean that they would be receptive to the voice of a Jewish refugee as the leader of an opposition against the regime. In any case, it wasn't a risk that the BBC was willing to take. So Wernicke stayed Wernicke, and Annemarie Hase remained anonymous. During the war years, the BBC's policy about hiding the identity of the refugee announcers occasionally even exhibited disturbing levels of paranoia. They did testing and asked reviewers to assess whether voices of anonymous announcers sounded Jewish, or whether the announcers pronounced things in a Jewish way, a Jewish inflection. And obviously there was anti-Semitism involved in such conduct and in these policies. But to some extent, the BBC also was simply responding to the reality in Germany at the time. The Nazi regime constantly portrayed any media affiliated with the Allies as Jewish lies that were meant to destroy and undermine Germany. And it directly attacked the BBC as a vessel of Jewish propaganda. So the BBC was working with the not unfounded assumption that German audiences would not be favorable to Jewish speakers. But as they did so, they also deployed similar anti-Semitic attitudes to the ones that were percolating in Germany at the time. Frau Wernicke's series aired from the summer of 1940 until the end of January 1944, with a short hiatus of a few months in between when Annemarie Hase had an operation. It's not entirely clear why the BBC decided to cancel the show before the war ended, especially considering the fact that it was quite successful and constantly acknowledged as such, and other very successful programs that were running on the German servers did broadcast until the end of the war, a few months after the war even. So it's not clear to me why exactly they made that decision. Hase herself was very disheartened by this decision to take Wernicke off the air. She wrote to her superiors, "I can't deny that your decision to take the Wernicke program off the air was a great disappointment to me. Not so much in economical as in ideological respect. I have always looked at my work at the BBC as a contribution, if only a small one, to the Allied cause, and a means of conveying genuine and true and democratic spirit to some of my fellow countrymen." So Wernicke's role was clearly not like any other role for her. It meant something special for her. It gave her a sense of mission. It invited her to play a not insignificant role in world historical events. And importantly for her, I think, it allowed her to continue to speak to those that she calls my fellow countrymen. Even if she seems to acknowledge that the message will probably only resonate with a few of them. In fact, it is likely that playing the role of Wernicke on the BBC allowed Hase to reach larger German audiences than ever before when she was performing on stages in Berlin, and certainly later in her post-war career. When the Second World War came to an end, Hase belonged to a very small minority of Jewish refugees who decided to return to Germany. Historians estimate that among the non-Jewish refugees who had to flee due to Nazi persecution, approximately half of them returned after the war. For the Jewish refugees who had to flee, it's probably less than 5%. And Annemarie Hase was one of these 5%. I don't have hard numbers, but anecdotally, I see in my work that that in this very small group of returnees, performers like Hase, who established themselves professionally before 1933, were highly represented. So they tended to return in higher numbers than people who either had other professions or who did not develop themselves professionally so successfully as she has in Germany before. It was not unheard of then for someone like herself to return to the defeated country, but it was certainly unusual. When she returned, something quite interesting happened. The German media reported her homecoming and celebrated it, but it wasn't Annemarie Hase's return that they cheered on. It was Frau Wernicke's return. One paper wrote, "Do you remember Frau Wernicke? But of course, she was the cheeky Berlinerin who during the Nazi years unabashedly spoke the truth with the Berlin dialect through the BBC broadcasts, and whose harsh but warm voice we secretly heard from the speaker. Now she stands before us in person." Another paper that covered her return added, "The warm, dark jeer of her voice with its abrupt, grotesque screeching was easy to identify when it resounded on the BBC German broadcasts through the muted radio. Word came out quickly who Frau Wernicke was. Annemarie Hase, an untransplantable person." I think the author of this piece is wrong to assume that most people would have recognized her voice on the radio. That was probably the case for people who were regulars at the Berlin cabaret scene and would have had the opportunity to actually see her performances live, but that's a very small segment of the German population at the time. So for most Germans, they would not have been able to identify Frau Wernicke as her. But regardless, the article clearly sought to claim Hase via Wernicke as an insider, someone who was just temporarily transplanted elsewhere, but who could never truly find a home anywhere else but in Berlin. For a brief period, Annemarie Hase lent her voice to the state radio broadcasting in East Germany. She was a socialist, and at least initially, she believed in the founding of a German socialist state. After her return, the new government in East Germany came up with the idea of trying to revive the Frau Wernicke broadcasts for propaganda purposes, but this time against the capitalist West. So when the revival was announced in print, the papers, the ads that were published for it read, Frau Wernicke, Annemarie Hase, 2 names but 1 concept. Who doesn't recall those days during the Nazi regime when secretly behind locked doors one adjusted the radio to listen to Frau Wernicke, spoken by Annemarie Hase at the BBC on the English wavelength. Frau Wernicke, who as a woman from the people of common sense denounced the condition of the time and gave us hope for a better future. And now the ad continued. Wernicke would once again be tasked with being the voice of common sense, only now with a new target for her satire. So what we see in these publications is that Hase's return was portrayed not simply as a remigration of any citizen who was gone and was coming back, but as the homecoming of Frau Wernicke herself, the character that many Germans grew very fond of during the war years. For the most part, the press coverage that accompanied her return ignored the reality that forced Hase into exile to begin with. The vehement racism that targeted her as a Jew and altered her life course remained vague, obscured, or even just completely left out. And with it also the broader implication of the Nazis' genocidal violence. Similar to other remigrants in her situation, her reappearance was often interpreted by the German public as sort of a signal that the days of horror really were gone and that a new Germany was about to start again. Hase's personal story was one of persecution, of flight, of displacement, and for a short period also intelligence work for a foreign enemy. These were experiences that the vast majority of people in German society at the time simply could not relate to. Frau Wernicke's stories, on the other hand, as they were told through the German service, they were about being stuck in air raid shelters during bombing campaigns of the Allies. They were about dealing with food shortages. They were about counting the war dead and hoping that your son or your husband or your brother comes back from the front safely. These were events and experiences that were familiar to average Germans who experienced the war on the home front. From the perspective of these average Germans, Annemarie Hase may have come back from exile, but Frau Wernicke, was she ever really gone? The overarching tone in these reports was characteristic of a discourse of omission and deflection that dominated the German public sphere during the early post-war decades. Her arrival at the end of the war was one thread among many that signaled the beginning of recovery, of the possibilities of restoring order, and it was thus greeted with enthusiasm. But Hase's presence in post-Nazi Germany also posed a threatening reminder of the injuries that the German public hoped to look away from at that point in their history. The German media overwhelmingly tried to depict Annemarie Hase in a way that the post-war public could best handle, as Frau Wernicke, a true Berliner who supposedly, at least, spoke on behalf of an entire nation when she condemned Nazism. This triumphant version was Wernicke's story, and telling it required ignoring crucial facets of Hase's story, that she became the target of racial hatred, that her art was portrayed as a degradation of the German people, that she was robbed on her place on the stage and amongst her people, and that she was forced to flee her home. For years during the Second World War, Hase passionately recorded broadcasts that encouraged Germans to defy Nazi tyranny. From across enemy lines, Germany audiences were listening to her, in the role of Frau Wernicke, communicate the messaging of British psychological warfare. Wernicke was created to strike a wedge between Germans and Nazis. And in order to do that effectively, she had to manifest that distinction. She personified the spirit of homegrown opposition, and she invited listeners to identify with her audacious outspokenness, even if they themselves were not that outspoken. She inventoried the great sacrifices and the losses that they endured under Nazism, and she also reassured them that the British understood the predicament of everyday Germans and that they would not seek revenge on the average German citizen after the Nazis would be defeated. Meanwhile, her identity, her fate as a victim of Nazism and anti-Semitic brutalities, the circumstances of her exile were intentionally kept hidden. And it's worth considering, I think, how the BBC's policy of blurring the identities and the experiences of people like Hase, how it contributed maybe to an atmosphere in which post-war Germany could very smoothly reclaim Annemarie Hase as one of their own, reclaim an affinity to her, embrace Frau Wernicke as an emblem of their life during wartime, while also openly resisting efforts to confront honestly the extent of the damage that National Socialism has wrought on its victims, including her. The BBC had good reasons to feel compelled to adopt this strategy, but the implications that it had for people like Annemarie Hase were of little concern to them. Annemarie Hase continued to live the rest of her life in Germany. Before the Berlin Wall was erected in 1961, she was living in the western part of the city, but was mainly working in the eastern part of the city because she was mainly involved in socialist theater productions. Worked very closely with the Bertolt Brecht theater company, for example. That was in accordance also with her ideological commitments, but her politics were not so strong as to push her to commit fully to life in the Eastern Bloc. And so when the Berlin Wall was erected in 1961, she opted to stay in the West and not to move to the socialist German in the East. She continued to pursue her career, which was waning and waning. She was still regularly booked for small roles in various theater pieces. And she passed away in February 1971. A few months before she died, in a correspondence with a friend who was at the time living in LA, she wrote to him that she felt that people have largely forgotten her. Today, I could say both in Germany as well as in England, her story is mostly forgotten. But now you know of her and of her extraordinary life and work. And for me, that's meaningful. So thank you so much for listening to her story.
Thank you, Shir, for a really wonderfully nuanced talk with lots of layers of irony. I open the floor to questions.
Yes?
Have you written a book about this? We'd rather like to buy one.
Oh, well, that's very kind of you. I can send you an article that I published about the BBC German service, and I have another one that will be published about her specifically, and I'm happy to send you both of these texts. I am in the process of writing a book, but it's connected, though not quite about this. And unfortunately, and to my surprise, there isn't that much English language research about the German service. There's a little bit, but in kind of like obscure academic publications that unfortunately don't really reach the public. But if we can exchange emails after, and I'm happy to send you what I wrote. Yeah.
What happened to her parents or other relatives who stayed in Germany?
So I'm not sure what happened to her mother, if she, there's so little biographic information remaining of her. So her father died already before the First World War. Her mother may have been old enough to have passed away in natural circumstances before deportations began. I'm really not quite sure. In correspondences that she wrote later in her life, she referenced that most of her family is kind of scattered, which was very typical of German Jews of her generation. So she wrote that she had relatives who were living in the United States, in England, and in South Africa. And as far as I know, she was the only one from her family that returned to Germany. Yeah.
Well, thanks for that, but would you be willing to speculate a little bit about her decision to come back to Berlin? You mentioned, it's a choice about 5% of people made, so it puts her in a striking minority. And I was thinking about her as an artist, and how much of her, at least based on this fascinating talk, how much of it was based on her mastery of German as a spoken language, and her speciality in the Berlin dialect, and a lot of the diaspora Jews who made it to the States and so forth, who were involved in the arts. I mean, some were able to famously make it in LA, or make it in Hollywood, or make it in New York, but maybe for her specialty, no one would care whether she was a master of the Berlin dialect in Hollywood. Was that like part of it, or how do you understand her being in that 5%?
Yeah, I think that it's potentially a mix of things. So one is certainly what you mentioned, and I think that is why professional performers are overrepresented in that very small group of returnees. People who felt that their audience was just in Central Europe were more compelled to return. She was someone who, it hadn't occurred to me before, but potentially if she did not have this employment with the BBC, maybe she would have developed an acting career in England. But she was busy doing propaganda in German language, so after the war, she didn't really have a portfolio or an acting career to speak of in England. I think that, again, she never openly discussed it, but the way that she quite quickly became involved with in East Germany may indicate that she also was ideologically excited about the idea of participating in building a new other Germany, which of the, again, that's another group that is overrepresented among Jewish returnees, people who had socialist or communist connections. And I have to wonder also whether her unclear affinity to her Jewishness played a role in that too. I don't know, but I think that perhaps it was a mix of these. Yeah.
Small question. She changed her name early to Hase, right? And why? You mentioned that. The other question, when she returned to Berlin, the Jewish Museum in Berlin just had a big exhibit about Jewish life in the GDR. Was she at all affiliated with the Jewish community? And Cantor Nachama served the small Jewish community in religious life. Was she affiliated with that? Do you know?
She performed in Jewish community centers in Germany. I did not find anything in her archive to indicate that she had any affiliation with the religious institutions, and that also didn't surprise me because I didn't see her throughout her life. But she was invited to perform in Jewish organizations and did so. So that is, again, one of these very traces and clues of her lifelong unclear relationship to Jewish people and Jewish communities, that she's a part of it, but also not really. It's difficult to decipher where she sees herself there. And the name change, it's really interesting. I think of it a lot as a parallel to the baptism in a way. It's kind of a pragmatic choice that a lot of Jewish performers are doing at the time, to change their name to something that sounds more German. I think the choice of Hase, which means rabbit, might also be a part of the comedy for her. But like the baptism, it was meant as a kind of stage identity and not really adopting a non-Jewish identity full on. And I should also add that when the Nazis forbade Jewish performers from performing to non-Jewish audiences, they also demanded that artists like her stop using a stage name, that they revert back to their birth name. So for a brief period, she was only allowed to perform in Germany as Anita Hirsch.
Yeah, just to comment on that, I mean, the same thing happened here in Hollywood in the 40s and 50s. Tony Curtis's real name was Bernie Schwartz.
The most famous Minnesotan.
And Kirk Douglas's name is like 10 miles long.
Right, yeah.
His real name was, but they all changed their names to some more.
And I think it's really interesting to see how it doesn't necessarily signal that they're distancing themselves from Jewishness or from a Jewish community or even from Jewish religious life. It's sort of almost an understanding that they're kind of like a thing you have to do without anything behind that, just to maybe, I don't know, like a kind of plastic surgery almost, I don't know. Yeah.
Did she have a Jewish burial? Is she buried in a Jewish cemetery?
That is a really good question. I'm actually not sure where in Berlin she's buried. I could probably find that out because I still have the newspaper clippings from when she passed away. That's a good question. I'm not sure. Yeah.
Thank you very much for this talk. I think I would also like to read the paper about the German service. My question is, do you know of other such personages like Frau Wernicke, tailor-made for other audiences, other classes, or other dialects and regions? And frankly, I'm a native of Austrian German, and I had a hard time understanding this clip that you.
Yeah, I'm really glad you brought this up. So there was also some fear in the BBC that because Frau Wernicke is a Berliner, that, and for those of you who are not aware, outside of northern Germany, Berliners are not necessarily seen very favorably. And also, you know, these German service propaganda broadcasts, people were hearing them in the former colonies, in Switzerland. They were heard throughout the world. So there was some concern that she would be too Prussian for a lot of Germans, and that, I mean, she certainly doesn't sound Prussian. But the BBC experimented for a while with a parallel women-oriented show for Austrian listeners that used the Viennese dialect. It wasn't as successful as Frau Wernicke. And there were also other broadcasts that were trying to fit kind of other audiences, soldiers on the front. There were programs that were targeting soldiers who were fighting. There were programs who were generally directed for the working classes, but not in a gender-specific way. The three most successful shows that are most commonly discussed in the German in the British intelligence reports are Frau Wernicke and two other shows that were broader, that were not specific. But definitely it's actually really impressive to see how the BBC, the British intelligence rather, together with the Jewish refugees who would be able to tell them about the segmentation of German society better, were trying to really cover all their bases and trying to create a propaganda program that would reach a wide audience. And they produced really impressive content at the time. And the BBC archive is filled with this material about the German service. It's really quite remarkable what they did in such a short time period.
Well, I get to ask one last question.
Okay.
Do we know to what extent she had control of her own scripts?
That's a really great question. So she was a native Berliner, and the person who wrote the scripts had a really impressive control or command of the dialect, rather, for someone who was from the former Habsburg territories, but it wasn't his native language in a way. So she often corrected him and added some fine-tuning to make it sound more believable and authentic that it's a Berliner speaking that way. In terms of the content itself, I don't think that she that she suggested content changes, but certainly linguistic and word choices that would make Frau Wernicke sound more believable, yeah.
So with that, thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.